Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 21 with Justin Clark. And we have a special guest, Nino Brown. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're really excited to have you to talk about the book. And for those who know, I am a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as is Nino. And our party has just released this incredible book called Revolutionary Education, Theory and Practice for Socialist Organizers. Nino is the editor of the book. I just want to say I loved reading this. I think there's so many great insights, and I really look forward to kind of unpacking a little bit about it. But before we do that, do you mind kind of telling our viewers who you are, kind of how you got involved in working on this book, and kind of why it's what inspired it and why it's sort of relevant to our current struggle?
Yeah, so peace, y'all. My name is Nino, organizer with the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, and in the Boston branch. And I'm a founding member of the Boston branch, and a lot of the theories that were embedded in this text were just really instrumental in, building the Revolutionary Party that I'm a part of. So, a lot of the text kind of reflects my own experience in building revolutionary theory, but also practice at the intersection of building an organization, a party. I kind of came to the work of, contributing to editing this book. It was a collective process. I think just to put that out there, it was a product of the Liberation School Committee, which is a committee that the Party for Socialism and Liberation has that focuses, specifically on political education, right? We understand that political education is the crux of how revolutionary movements can not only attain victories, but consolidate victories and expand the revolutionary movement. And I'm one of the many comrades who are a part of that collective. All of the different essays and chapters that are in this text were essays that were published on liberationschool.org, which is the PSL's more or less theoretical website that deals more with deeper history, politics, strategy, and tactics. And given the period that we're in, coming out of the mass rebellion of 2020, and really the resurgence of a socialist movement in this country, it flows from really our party's general orientation is that we need to be the ones to maintain the ideological continuity between the revolutionary history that we come from in the 1930s, even really going back all the way to the formation of the First International. But our party has recognized that there is this ideological gap that exists after the fall of the Soviet Union and the so-called, ending of the Cold War. And our party recognizes that everyone has the potential to be an educator, right? And a lot of what revolutionary struggle is about is education, right? Merging theory with practice, walking people through their own experiences. Obviously not, it's not a predetermined and dogmatic process, but education is really the lubricant in that process of radicalization. And in order for there to be a revolution in the United States, under these conditions, we have to learn as much as we can from all the revolutionary struggles that have taken place over the last few centuries, right? If we understand that revolutionary theory is the crystallization of the general lessons of the class struggle, right? We cannot dispense without it. And in fact, we have to see ourselves in continuity, active continuity as revolutionary subjects, not just objects, whereas, things happen to us, right? We are the ones that make history, right? The masses are people who make history. But I'll just stop there. I've been talking for a bit, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. And I agree with you in terms of the idea of education being such a crucial component to, building a revolutionary movement. It's part of the reason why I joined the PSL last year, and I'm now a full member of the Indianapolis branch, and really genuinely believe in building that sort of organizational structure that is, predicated on that blending of theory and practice. And that's really what this book does a great job of, is sort of balancing between thinking through some really interesting educational ideas and theories from, scholars of the past, mixed with people on the ground today implementing a lot of those sort of revolutionary pedagogical ideas into our mainstream struggle, or into our struggle rather. And so that's what's got me really excited about the book. One of my comrades in Indianapolis, Derek Ford, did a couple chapters in the book. You have a great chapter about building cadre, which I'll ask you a little bit about later. And so, yeah, we'll just sort of kind of start getting into it. But Cory, did you have any other questions or comments before I kind of go on with my other question?
No, I'm good. I'm interested in hearing about the book and the differing perspectives that come out of it.
Okay, great. Cool. Well, I guess we'll start really with kind of the first sort of major educator figure who's covered in the book, is a guy named Lev Vygotsky. Can you tell us a little bit about Lev and Vygotsky, and kind of what is his idea of zone of proximal development, and kind of how Marxism deeply influenced his ideas on education, and how I think they're still applicable today?
Yeah, definitely. So one is I'm an educator, former educator. I just stopped teaching this past year, but for about 6 years, I taught public school. And Lev Vygotsky was someone who I was introduced through my master's program for education. And nowhere in that educational process was it indicated that Lev was even a Marxist or a socialist or communist, what have you, or Bolshevik, right? I would say that Lev Vygotsky has gotten sort of the Dr. King treatment, where he's, posthumously been just robbed of all of his radical and revolutionary current. And, so my first introduction to Lev Vygotsky was, this de-radicalized guy who really just talked about the zone of proximal development, which I'll get into a bit later. But essentially, Lev was born in Russia. He was Jewish, lived during the time of the Russian Empire, and under Tsarist Russia. And at the time, Jewish people were incredibly oppressed and faced, horrible anti-Semitic pogroms and just general oppression under the Tsarist regime. And, Lev Vygotsky was a victim of Tsarism and anti-Semitism. He was not able to attend university because of his religion. And once the Bolshevik Revolution took place, and he was able to, have a state power to back his education, but also, allow for the development of national and religious minorities. He, took aim at the belief that, child thought evolves through fixed, natural, and separate and unrelated stages, right? Bourgeois thinking and capitalist ideology has us believe that, or indoctrinates us to believe that, from a certain age, 0 to 6, 0 to 5, all children go through these particular things, and it's natural. And that is completely distinct from the next stage of their development, their adolescent years and into adulthood, right? And you can see how there's reactionary seeds in that by just saying that, well, this is just a natural result of, of being Jewish or being Black, right? All Black children go through this particular stage, or any kind of children go through this particular stage, as opposed to looking at, development dialectically and not just as a matter of, biological predetermination, right? This is something that is mediated by social factors, right? We hear this all the time in education, right? That your zip code should not be your destiny. Just because a child or student, lives in a certain zip code, a certain area, that should not be their destiny if they attain higher education or have you, or have access to education. But because of the social system, that is what mediates intelligence, and not some biological, natural essence in human beings, or roughly put. But Vygotsky kind of took aim at this, bourgeois thinking, and his concept of the zone of proximal development really based off of Marxist understanding of development being historical, right? Being historically determined by social conditions, social, economic, political, historical conditions, not just in a vacuum. And when I was in my graduate program, like I said, everything about Marx, Engels, Lenin, about Vygotsky was just purged, put to the side, ignored. It was only when I joined the PSL that I learned that Vygotsky was a communist and socialist, just like many others, like Pablo Picasso, Langston Hughes, right? But I guess to speak more to the ZPD, right, the zone of proximal development, it's essentially the idea that as individual learners, right, or even just children, that they have, historically determined levels of development in particular subjects. They have to be assessed through, the correct or more appropriate testing instruments, right, based on where someone actually is in their development and their potential, right? That difference between their potential for development and their actual condition is more generally what's referred to as the zone of proximal development. It's essentially, to put it metaphorically, how you bend so as not to break, right? In order to push, yourself to a reasonable limit where that's where you're struggling with the information or the knowledge or whatever you're trying to engage in. And in that struggle, that is the proximal area of your development between your actual condition and your potential, which is, for Vygotsky, is always mediated by the social, right? It's never just, occurring in a vacuum as an individual, which is what the United States education system pushes, right? This pragmatist, individualistic notion that the so-called founding fathers were just these amazing individuals that just kept on pushing through all conditions, irrespective of, whoever is a part of those conditions, right? i.e. Native Americans and African people. But so yeah, in essence, the ZPD is the gap, right, between your current level of development and, where your potential for development lies. But I've been talking for a minute, and I think that kind of covers it in the main. But obviously, the Marxism is, completely taken out of modern discussions of Vygotsky. And in publishing this book, we would hope that educators would read the text and question their own education. Right? That's as James Baldwin would say, that's the true mark of an educated person, is when you begin to question your own education itself.
Yeah, that's great, because I had never heard of him before, because I was not an education major for very long in college. I was for a year, and then I just switched to history, poli, sci. But so it was somebody I never knew about. And so learning it brand new, it was kind of, oh, this is very exciting. Like this is a very interesting idea. And, I think it always underscores the fact that education really is based upon historical and material conditions, that the ways in which we learn are sort of mediated by the forces of society and history that are working all around us. And, I think that the idea of the zone of proximal development really allows for us to see essentially more potential in people than we would see otherwise in the sort of traditional capitalist mode of education, which I think is very, very exciting. And to sort of like dovetail on talking about like figures who have sort of been, MLKized, as you're sort of referring to. The same pretty much happened to Paulo Freire, and who's another key figure who looms large over the book. And Derek's excellent chapter on Freire is, I think, essential reading across the board. So I guess that'll be the kind of the next person I'd like to chat with you about is, who was Paulo Freire as well, and how is his work kind of like Vygotsky? How is it sort of kind of stripped of its revolutionary content, and how do we try to recontextualize the revolutionary elements of his educational ideas?
Yeah, definitely agree about the MLK treatment to Paulo Freire as well. When I was in undergrad, I studied Paulo Freire for the first time, and the way that he was presented to us was completely doctored. The only chapters, I think we read just select chapters out of his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is one of many texts that he's published. He published letters to Guinea-Bissau, the militants engaged in the anti-colonial national liberation struggle there. He wrote Pedagogy of Hope, Pedagogy of Indignation, Pedagogy of the City, and so many other texts that critique capitalist hegemony and pedagogy. But more to why Paulo Freire, who he was, and why the need to doctor him arose. So I'm not a biographer of Paulo, but essentially, he's a Brazilian educator who was a radical humanist and Marxist who was in exile from Brazil during the years of fascist dictatorship. And he was in exile because of the role that he played in doing political education among the peasant classes in Brazil, which were the majority class in Brazil at the time that he was there. And in essence, the way that he engaged in political education was, tinged with Marxist and Leninist ideology, right? And the essence being that the masses of people make history, not individuals, right? That the working class or working classes, their liberation has to be the work of the working class itself, as we often say in organization I work with, Jericho, our founding member Jalil Muntakim says, we are our own liberators. So for that reason, Paulo was, expelled because he was an effective political educator, was able to guide the process of education of the peasant class to gain a literacy that was not just reading the word, but being able to read the word so as able to read the world and transform the world and see oneself as an active part of the larger objective conditions. If we understand that the objective conditions, such as, the changes in the economy, the boom and bust cycle of capitalism, things that are outside of our control, contain many subjectivities, right? People, actual living human beings who have cultures, who have history, who have social contexts, they have religions, and so on. And it's out of these experiences that the people understand themselves and their place in the world. And that understanding, is a radical one. Freire would argue that education is not a neutral endeavor. It's inevitably political, right? As long as we live under a class society. But I think actually I forgot the second half of your question. I apologize. I got into biography, but
no, I think you nailed it. I mean, basically, that was kind of what I was getting at is that there was this sort of erasure of his revolutionary ideals and ideas and how they influenced his idea of pedagogy, and how basically it's like I don't remember how many chapters in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but it's like most educational students will read like chapters like 1 and 2 or 3, and then once you get to like 3 or 4 or 5, that's when it starts getting more radical, and you don't read those. I guess the one thing I wanted to mention to just to kind of complement what we were talking about with the zone of proximal development. So one of Freire's, I think, real contributions is the idea of the dialogic model. So most education, especially in the United States, or Cory, in your case, like in Canada or whatever, is this idea of what they call the banking model, where you sort of see students as like these empty piggy banks or these empty glasses, and you're just filling them with information, and you kind of treat them all the same. And that there's an assumed authority of the teacher over the students. Whereas the dialogic model is completely different. It sort of accepts, it sort of embraces the fact that students come with different experiences and different backgrounds and different ideas. And the teacher is sort of in dialogue with them, hence the term dialogic. It's very dialectical. It's very much influenced by Marxism. But it's this idea of having students in more of a dialogue with their teacher, and the teacher not necessarily assuming full authority over the students. I think Freire, and I never noticed this because I never knew about him until I really read this book or met Derek, because I was never really involved in education either. But in my background in public history, I have a master's in public history. I'm a public history historian by profession. We have this idea in public history that's very similar to Freire's, which is called shared authority. And shared authority is this idea that, traditional history is usually the historian is the person who has the authority, and the people have to listen to the authority, right? What shared authority is that we have a dialogue between us and the people learning about history, and that they're going to bring their experiences and their knowledge and their wisdom to us, and we can learn from them as well. In fact, we actually have the idea of something called the Dialogic Museum. Which, if you go to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City, that's pretty much how that museum is set up. It's set up as it's sort of a dialogic model where it's not just like a tour guide just dumping information on you, and you just sort of, again, banking it, but rather you bring your own experiences. And they tie the experiences of people who lived in the Lower East Side, which at the time that this building's sort of historical relevance was mostly a German American community, German immigrants, then it would become Eastern European immigrants and Jewish immigrants. And they tie the labor struggles of the people who lived in that area to the current labor struggles today. And they try to make parallels, and they ask people about their experiences as laborers and as workers. So that was something that when I was reading this book and learning about him, calling it the dialogic model, I was like, oh my gosh, this is very similar to a lot of the public history ideas that I have, and why I genuinely believe in having a real dialogue about educational processes, rather than it just being this sort of like, I'm the authority, you listen to me. Because I think that the role of us as public historians is that we've always believed in the power of our audience to help not only inform what we do, but to improve what we do. So that was the stuff that I really took away and I thought was really great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, Cory, if you want it to happen as well, but I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems awfully non-hierarchical to me. Like, I appreciate that. The idea of education system should be something that brings out the best in students, right? Rather than dictating to them the way that they have to conform. So, yeah, that sounds really good to me. I didn't know any of this stuff before, so I'm just trying to learn here.
Yeah, no, it's very, very exciting stuff. And, I feel the same way. It's kind of like I used to always think for years and years that I was bad at math. This was something I used to always say to myself, oh, I'm bad at math. I'm bad at math. And I've learned over the years that one, there were a couple experiences that informed why I don't necessarily think that's true. One is that when I was in college, I took this semester-long math course that was discrete math. It was logic, graph theory, statistics, and probability. And it was the first half of the course was one grade, and the second half of the course was another grade. And the logic and graph theory section of that course, I got an A in. And it was the first A I'd ever gotten in math since the third grade. And I went, wow, okay, so what made it different? And I realized what made it different. The professor, he was great. He's a guy named Joshua Gadamoller, taught at IU Kokomo. What he did was he would define terms of mathematical concepts using language. So he would write out a definition of something. And I realized, oh my goodness, that's how I learn. Because when it becomes more abstract, like in terms of like equations and stuff, I have a hard time. But if you put it in like English and I can read it, it makes a lot more sense. And that's what he would do. He would define things. And so I realized like we have to be open to different teaching styles. And, because I think to myself, like I could have been much better at math when I was younger had I had a teacher who understood my own learning style, instead of trying to have this sort of like shotgun approach where you sort of just do it one way and see how much it sticks with people. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the thing I kept thinking about is that it's like, I don't think anybody's necessarily bad at anything. I think it's that we were poorly taught, or, it's a concept, or there are things that just aren't natural, not to say that they're natural to us, but basically there's some things that we might have more trouble with others based on our own individual learning styles. And I think that like Freire's model and Vygotsky's model really emphasize the fact that people learn differently, and sort of trying to tailor the educational experience to students based on that. It's really interesting too, like we talk about like the problem with sort of the individualism within American education. Ironically enough, this like obsession with trying to think of students individually has kind of really churned out this very like backward, bureaucratic, kind of crappy form of education, which ultimately kind of undermines the individual student, which and so like these kinds of different models actually in many ways reaffirm like the positive worth and individuality of students, and while simultaneously having them be a part of shared experiences. So that's the thing that I'm very interested in, and I think is very, very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as a public school teacher, I can definitely, the public school system was not developed to edify human beings. It was developed to create compliant, acquiescent, to create the type of worker that capitalism needs. And obviously, the fact that workers fight for higher wages, healthcare, they fight for a union and beyond, all those things, we have to learn from the people in order to guide them through those struggles. And, I think just a piece on what you're saying about, your experience with that professor, being a activist and organizer and a teacher and being in the PSL has been a very humbling experience because, as we kind of feel like, it doesn't matter if you voted Democrat in the last election, like you have something to teach us, right? Like you can learn something from everyone, right? And when you're organizing, if you take on like an arrogant attitude of like, we're giving you knowledge, right? That's how Marxism is often caricatured of like saying that we are the enlightened and we're enlightening the unenlightened, but it's really not that simple, right? The workers and oppressed actually have the experiences that need to be crystallized into a theory, and they're denied that access because of, obviously the cost of education. The type of education that we're given is very boilerplate. And I think, almost dialectically, we see that neoliberal turn in education where everything is allegedly in name about the individual, but it undermines the individual, just as how, capitalism says that communism means you have no property, whereas under capitalism, you have no property.
Yeah, that's totally right. And I think that's the sort of maddening aspect of the fact that in the United States, it's like we spend so much money on education. To a certain extent, obviously, there are numerous schools that are way underfunded, but we spend a lot of money on education. And it seems like there are countries that have less resources who do much, much better in terms of educating their people. I think of, I especially think of countries like Cuba, for example, or another country that's sort of mentioned in this book, which is Guinea-Bissau, and thinking about the other sort of major figure who's a part of this book, who takes these theoretical concepts and really puts them into practice as a revolutionary leader, and that's Amica Cabral. The first time I'd ever heard Amica Cabral's name was on an episode of the Michael Brooks Show years ago. I remember him mentioning it, and I went, that guy's interesting. I'll look into that. And then I sort of forgot for a while, and then I came back and I realized, there's going to be a whole chapter in this book on this. And it was so enlightening. So could you tell us a little bit about Cabral and his and why his educational approach was so transformative for his people?
Yeah, definitely. So Amica Cabral was one of the sharpest African liberation leaders in the 20th century. Like you, I discovered Cabral a lot later in life. Just searching for African, socialist and leftist movements, and Amica Cabral, as well as Thomas Sankara, Samora Machel, people who we don't really hear about a lot on the mainstream left, or even at all. And Cabral,
Kwame Nkrumah as well.
Nkrumah, Sekou Touré. I mean, the list goes on. But
yep.
Cabral's approach to education was so transformative was because it was very situated in a dialectical, relation to the larger social system of colonialism, Portuguese fascism. He was able to really live in the subjectivity and not lose sight of the larger social system, such that he was able to create theory that was very useful to the practice of building an anti-colonial national liberation struggle, quantitatively accumulating forces through expanding bases, but also from that understanding of dialectical understanding of the relationship of the colony to the imperial core, he was able to build solidarity based on the long-term interests of the Portuguese working classes, right? Some other currents within Portuguese, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verdean society were more racialist and nationalist. As we see today, the governing parties are more so just focused on like racialist and nationalist politics that are dead in politic. Whereas Cabral, he was actually kind of pilloried posthumously because he had the insight to recognize the historical interest between the Portuguese working classes in the imperial core and the colonies. He saw that as Portugal's fascism intensified, right, that did not benefit the working classes of Portugal, and it definitely didn't benefit anyone in Guinea-Bissau. So when they captured, I think they captured some 20,000 Portuguese soldiers, and instead of executing them, his idea was, well, what lessons can we teach them? Like, what do we have to teach the Portuguese working class, right? Which again, I think is very humbling, right? It's like the colonies are actually teaching the workers in the metropole. And because, of those 20,000 or so Portuguese soldiers who were not assassinated, they were essentially, educated and sent and let free. And, after the liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, we see popular forces, popular rebellions in Portugal, right? Almost leading to a socialist revolution. And a lot of the bulk of that was because of the pedagogical work that Cabral did. And, like I said, thinking dialectically, thinking contextually, thinking about the concrete subjectivities. Who are the people that we're working with? Who are the different tribes? How do we get to know our people so well that, we can tailor our political education such that people become radicalized based off of their own realizations and their own experiences? Cabral, opposed really dogmatism. He kind of critiqued Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare and his, 3 stages of, essentially guerrilla warfare, saying that, we have to find our own particular conditions. Obviously, we're not going to ignore Portuguese colonialism and imperialism and capitalism, but our revolution is going to have to be made off of the rich subjective experiences of everyone. Cabral was often championed for really just being a good listener and learner. And I think that's a big lesson for us today in the U.S. left, because, we're raised,
Yeah.
we know everything. And it's really just a question of people not knowing. There's so much information. Just Google it. People need to be go through their own educational experiences. Part of why I joined the PSL was just because, when I first went to the PSL office in Harlem, I was like, oh, I'm probably going to see, a picture of like Lenin and Mao or something, or Marx. And it was pictures of American heroes like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, because the revolution here has to be based off of the actual history here. You can know everything you want about China, you can know everything you want about Cuba, but if you don't know the actual country that you're trying to make a revolution in, good luck. It's impossible.
Yeah, that's totally right. One of my, big influences as somebody who is born and raised in Indiana, is in the Midwest, is Eugene B. Debs. And the influence of Debs is a huge part of my sort of awakening as a socialist. And, he was very good, I think, at being able to understand the conditions of the workers in places like Chicago, in places like Kansas. He was very good at being able to figure out their general concerns. The other thing too is that like any great revolutionary leader, Debs becomes more radical over time, and so by the end of his life, he's basically says, I'm a Bolshevik, and he supports the revolution in the Soviet Union and in Russia rather, and so it's pretty cool considering that the only office that he ever held was a 2-year term in the Indiana House of Representatives as a Democrat. And so he went from that to being who he would become. And I think that's a story that's really important too, And so I think you're right about thinking about the history of American socialism and sort of all of its different forms and how that should inform who we are. And I think that's great. So I would love to talk a little bit about your chapter in the book, which is all about, that building organization and creating cadre. And cadre is a word that's kind of thrown out a lot. And I think a lot of folks who may not be involved in, Marxist organizations or Leninist organizations might not know what the word sort of cadre means. So maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about sort of what does it mean to be cadre? How do we build an organization, and how do we actually make cadre that are effective?
Cadres, as Che would put it, they are the backbone of the revolution, right? The cadres are, well, I'll give you an example of maybe capitalist cadres, right? We have the capitalist cadres, the lobbies, the folks who come out of Harvard University, MIT, the creme de la creme, right? The cadres who make the New York Times be the bourgeois imperialist rag that it is, right? So we understand that the ruling class creates their own cadres through their educational institutions, political institutions, and they are really the backbones of counter-revolution, right? The backbones of keeping white supremacy, sexism, capitalism intact, right? The professional counter-revolutionaries, right? So we want to do the opposite. We want to create cadres, people who are not weekend warriors or, fly-by-the-night activists or, I would even say like helicopter activists, really with like the post-Ferguson movement of, someone just drops in and then they're the face of the movement somehow and the revolution's betrayed, right? Or the rebellion's betrayed. But essentially, I wrote this chapter, I think it was maybe first in 2017. We were at a particular period where we needed to, it was initially a speech that was given to comrades about the need to consolidate the backbones of the coming revolution. And this was in 2017 or 18. And we obviously saw what 2019 and 2020 just revealed. We were like, well, we need leaders. We need folks who are going to falter when others flee. We need folks who are going to put others above themselves. I had the pleasure of meeting Fred Hampton Jr., Fred Hampton's son, and he said that, people get involved in movements that are larger than themselves because of either aspiration, inspiration, or desperation. People either aspire to be something more sublime or, I want to be like Dr. King, I want to be like, someone who I look up to, or they're inspired, by something outside of them and perhaps also inside of them as well. But then also there's desperation, right? When the conditions become so desperate that the workers are forced, people, the oppressed are forced to come together, right? It's either, if we as leaders do not organize the people, the conditions will organize the people, as you can see when there's a strike or a spontaneous outburst, right? So Ferguson or George Floyd rebellion, it's spontaneous to us, but it's built off of the compounding issues that were never resolved throughout history. Radical Reconstruction and Civil War, that they never really resolved. They just put a Band-Aid over it and let it fester, and then they put a bigger Band-Aid, and then in 2020, we have a conflagration that leads to tens of millions of people, in open rebellion. But in essence, the cadres are the professional revolutionaries, not professional in the sense that they are, like bourgeois pencil necks or something, right? But they are serious, that this is not a hobby. This is, it's either socialism or barbarism. Personally, I'll just say, if I live to be 80, or 70, I'm definitely not trying to be saying, Black Lives Matter. That should be in a museum. Like, we should have already won. Like, we should. The point is made, but the chapter pulls a lot from Lenin's Left-Wing Communism, which is a must-read for every serious revolutionary in this country. Lenin wrote Left-Wing Communism to really summarize the lessons of the Russian Revolution, but also to reply to people who were praising him, right? Praising him and the Bolsheviks without understanding how did we actually win, right? Because there are folks who, it's when people are in the streets and there's a massive rebellion, it's easy to be, oh yeah, I'm a revolutionary, I'm in the streets with the people. But the most difficult time to be a revolutionary is when that is not popular, when it's not chic, when it's not Vogue, when it's not, on the headlines, right? Because the work that we do then prepares us directly for when there's a political or social economic crisis, because we know it's coming, right? No one could predict COVID-19, but we know it's coming. Right, we know that there's a very horrible healthcare system. Right, we know that the United States disinvested from all the pandemic preparation that they needed to, prepare for a pandemic, and we saw what happened. We know that the police kill 1,000 people every year, and those people have families, they have loved ones, they have neighbors. Like, if this is happening every year, we know that it has to reach a tipping point, right? Quantity has to lead to quality, and if we don't prepare, then we become obstacles to ourselves. I say, because if you look at the Egyptian Revolution, they didn't have any cadres. They didn't really have like a modicum of a program of an alternative, right? And not just the ideas in the program, but who's going to really be the tireless workers to make sure this happens, right? Because it is tireless work. It's joyous. I will say that, right? But being a cadre is not like getting a title, right? It's earned through struggle. I'll just end with, I wanted to go back to the left-wing communism piece because I think it's just so critical to understanding, leftism today. Lenin defines ultra-leftism really essentially as being so far ahead of the masses that you lose them. And he, presents the formula that ultra-leftism is left in form, but right in essence. So sometimes it's so left. I guess is maybe the real horseshoe theory. He says, well, it's so left that it's, it's far beyond where the people actually are. And if people are not prepared, if you're not meeting people where they're at, and you're just trying to say, well, we need to, struggle and take over the system, what have you, without the necessary preparations, without people going through their own experiences, without all the methods of, civil discourse being exhausted, and people really learning, right? That's a whole educational process, which is why we always ask people in the PSL, how did you become a socialist? Nobody wakes up a socialist. Nobody wakes up saying, I am going to take on the American empire. That doesn't just happen, right? At least I don't think it happens, but Lenin says in left-wing communism that the Bolsheviks were only able to achieve that victory because of the decade plus of painful experiences, right? The 1905 revolution, when they won a Duma, a legislature, and they were against the Duma, but then they realized that, well, we have to enter into the Duma so that we can learn how to be revolutionaries if we can learn how to be revolutionaries in the lion's den, in the devil's pit, then we can be revolutionaries on the outside, right? And we saw what happened with World War I. All the socialists, European socialists, said, if our ruling classes go to war, we're going to be against them. And when World War I occurred, the majority of the European socialists, they sided with their own ruling class and supported the slaughter of, not only Black and brown people in the colonies, but their own working classes in France, in Germany, in England, what have you. And only the Bolsheviks were able to stick to their principles. And they faced jail. They faced hard labor in prison. And that's, but those were rich experiences. Lenin saying we could not have won in 1917 if we did not go through that. And if we took an ultra left position of just saying, well, we don't need to engage with the Duma. Well, the masses are engaging with the Duma. How are you going to make a revolution of the masses if you're just talking to the choir, essentially? But anyways, I say all that to say the lesson was for our comrades that, we cannot engage in ultra leftism because it really just aids the right wing, right? It really just, it doesn't create the conditions for real learning, because we need to meet people where they're at and not use that as an excuse to leave them where they're at, which oftentimes it is. People say we meet them where they're at. And, oftentimes it's used to water down the politics. And one thing we, push is that people can understand, like, all of this theory and history belongs to the working class, right? There are some folks who summarize it and crystallize it, but it's the actual living struggles of people over hundreds of years fighting oppression, colonialism, slavery, capitalism. And this is their knowledge. This is their theory. And we're not gonna win them over if we have an arrogant ultra left attitude of, it's all just you need a revolution. As Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party would put it, we need to get people from A to Z. And if we're just saying Z, 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 and not thinking about, well, this person's at B, they're not even at Z. How do we actually get them there through a process with them? If we're not the cadres that are patient, kind, humble, and listening, then we're just going to be obstacles to ourselves in the revolution, right? We're just going to be picking the rock up, as Mao says, only to drop it on our foot.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And for those listening, we will be covering left-wing communism in a future episode. That one we will definitely do. I have it scheduled for next year, but we're going to do that one. The Lenin book we're going to do this year on the podcast is going to be imperialism. We've already done State and Revolution. We'll do imperialism, and then we're going to do left-wing communism and infantile disorder in 2023. Schedule willing, all that. So,
Yeah.
But I think that this is something that was really crucial to me. So to give you some background, and Cory knows a little bit about this. So I used to be a member of the DSA. I was a DSAer for about a year. I had come out of the Bernie campaign and joined DSA. And my disaffection with the DSA was mainly out of the problems with an organization like the DSA, where it's this big tent organization where kind of anybody can join and there's no real commitments, right? You don't really have cadre in DSA. You just don't, right? And, getting involved with the PSL was completely different, because there's a certain level of dedication. There's a certain level of expectations of what you seek to do and who you seek to become within the revolutionary struggle. And I found that ultimately refreshing, because it gave me a guide path to go forward, right? And I think that's kind of the problem, in my opinion, with ultra leftism, or the sort of even the DSA types, is that it's kind of they're all in a room in the dark, and they're trying to get to the door, but none of them knows where the flashlight is, or hey, did anybody pack a flashlight? Does anybody have one so we can know where it is? Hey, does somebody want to feel around? There's no planning. And so because there's no planning, everything kind of falls apart. So that's why I find being a part of PSL and the idea of cadre so important, because it really underscores the value of organization. The other thing I'd add to that is that, if we seek to have revolution, and then we seek to build a society afterwards, well, we not only have to have like the support of the people as a part of that struggle, but also like we as cadre, as a part of the people's struggle, have to show that we're capable of governing, which is kind of the other thing too. So, organizations that teach you to be, professional activists or cadre provide you with the skills to be able to govern and be a part of the growing people's government, once a revolution happens. So that's kind of the other thing too, is it allows you to sort of cut your teeth, which I think is very, very relevant to the struggle. I think the last thing I'd like to kind of chat with you about before we finish up is kind of talking about like, what are some concrete tips and sort of strategies that organizers can use when educating others? This is kind of like the last couple appendices of the book kind of talk about, specific strategies that organizers can use to help educate folks. And I'd just like for you to kind of maybe share some of your favorites from those sections.
Yeah, definitely. So this was the sections of the book. We decided to add these on because of, as a teacher myself, I would often be told that if you didn't teach it, if they didn't learn it, they would say, Mr. Brown, you didn't teach it if they didn't learn it. And in order to facilitate learning, I realized that if you as an educator are doing 80% of the work, or the majority of the work, even, a majority of the intellectual labor, then you messed up, right? You need to give people tools so that they can do the intellectual work, because it's them that need to learn. They have to, go through their own experiences. So the appendices, outline some tactics. Lecturing and presenting, I think, in my opinion, is my favorite, because I think it's how a lot of young people, I think a lot of people today engage, in the YouTube sphere of just listening to podcasts, whether it's Joe Rogan or what's his name, Slavoj Žižek, or Kwame Ture, who's sometimes going viral in like left internet spheres or what have you. And I think it's often attacked, it's just like, oh, lecturing is banking model, whereas it's not necessarily true. I think that's one of the biggest things, I think, to debunk, right? You can critically engage with someone through a lecture, right? First, by knowing your audience, there are terms of phrases and rhetoric and questions you can ask that can, engage folks. Also, there's the quote curation tactic that, essentially folks read a text together. Everyone is tasked to pull out quotes that speak to them for a particular reason, whether it's something that resonated with you or something you want to apply, something that relates to another concept or idea, right? Because these type of thinking or frameworks allow people to apply knowledge, right? To pull out something, pull out a concept and take it outside of the text and into the realm of creativity, the realm of human, political activity, I would say. Also, maybe I'll just end with two. I think media analysis and role plays, I think, are just immensely important. We know that 90% of the media is owned by 5 corporations, maybe more than 90% now. So we have to be adept at sifting through the bourgeois press. We can't just say, oh, we can't just say this is bourgeois propaganda. Well, that's not an argument.
Right.
Like it could 99% of the time it is bourgeois propaganda.
But you have to show people why.
And I think the media analysis trains folks to really speak to like what is the contemporary cadres of the ruling class saying, right? What are the New York Times, the Washington Post? How do we reply, right? So we can ask folks to come with a news clip or a video clip or an excerpt and break it down together, right? And I think lastly, the role play, for labor organizing, it's just like a staple. But, oftentimes, I wouldn't even really get into that, but role playing essentially allows folks to practice their muscles and skills that are just underdeveloped, right? Whether it's door knocking, engaging in phone calls, sometimes you're cold calling folks, role playing. How would you contextualize the crisis in the Ukraine to your coworker, right? Or how would you role play with someone who maybe is progressive on one thing but then reactionary on another, right? Because we do know working class people have mixed consciousness. I've definitely met folks who are like, yeah, I'm for defunding the police and I'm against, police violence, but then they're pro, gentrification or pro, urban development or urban renewal. And role playing really allows us to put ourselves into uncomfortable positions, right? Because as long as you're comfortable, if you're comfortable as an organizer, I would say you're not organizing, right? Organizing is a very uncomfortable thing. We're just trained to be in our individual pods and think about our individual selves, and role playing allows you to step out of that. So those are just my favorite tools from the appendices. There's more about the type of questions that you can ask as a teacher. There's often base knowledge questions like, what do you recall? When did this occur? But then there's comprehension questions that orient to elicit from people their own explanation, right? Sometimes when I'm teaching classes, people will say, "Oh, what that person said. Well, I agree with that person said." Well, you can't say I agree with that person when you're trying to organize your coworkers into a labor union. You need to be the one to say it. It can't be like, "Oh, Mao said." Mao's not there. It's you. And I think the last thing is really just application. I think application and analysis and synthesis, right? There's two struggles that we're always engaged in. The struggle against the capitalist, the boss, the landlord, and then there's the struggle for summation, right? What are the lessons from the fight, right? Because that's where theory is crystallized. Theory is not, some academic thing in, MIT or whatever, even the postmodernists or whatever they're saying, right? Theory is the crystallized experience of the class struggle, right? That's all it is. People have experiences and we crystallize it. What are the lessons? And turn it into a tool. And as organizers, we have to always be thinking, what are the lessons? How do we synthesize this? How do we ask the questions and put people into situations where they have to apply the knowledge and thus extend their knowledge and their experiences so that we can create more cadres, because without that, we'll just have the same people doing the thinking, the same people doing the work. And to the piece on governing, we had some comrades from Haiti when I was in New York City, and they said, so who's going to be the prime minister of such and such? Who's going to be the governor of this? And we were like, well, we're a very small party, we're not even thinking like that. But for them, 8 million people in New York City is a whole country. They're like, oh, well, they're already thinking on that level because that's their whole country, right? And I think, one thing we're tasked with doing is that we have to find people who are better than us among the masses because we know they exist. The people who, they'll stay after work and work so hard for their boss and what have you. We need the people who are going to stay and work for the people.
Turn them.
Exactly. Those are the people who are going to who need to govern, right? That are just denied. They're not asked at all. But I'll just start there. So,
no, those are wonderful, and I think I just want to reiterate the sort of relevance of the lecture. So, that's how I learn. That's my learning sort of language is lecture. I find that I've always really enjoyed hearing someone speak, and obviously the clips that go viral of Kwame Ture or another one of my heroes, Michael Perenni. That goes viral is always kind of wonderful to watch. And, I think that the beauty of the sort of tangible techniques that are in the appendices of this book I think can be applied to any different types of situations within a revolutionary struggle, whether like you said, whether it's labor organizing, whether maybe you're setting up some kind of tenants' rights association, or you're setting up some kind of, something like, student union or something like that. Like it allows you, it has that certain like flexibility. And that's, I think, the beauty of what I get out of Marxism, which is that people sort of think of it as this being very straight and very sort of, straight-jacketed approach, and it's very dogmatic, and it's this and that. And it's like, no, it's actually very flexible. We're very open to new ideas. We are constantly reconfiguring our own perspectives and our own approaches based on the real experiences that we've had as organizers. And so that's kind of the beauty of it, is that this book does a wonderful job, I think, of being able to make things accessible without abandoning a lot of the really interesting theoretical points, or the very, I think, integral elements of learning about pedagogy. So, with that in mind, I cannot thank you enough for spending some time with us tonight. This was absolutely wonderful. I highly recommend people check out the book, Revolutionary Education, Theory and Practice for Socialist Organizers, published by Liberation Media and the PSL. And those are kind of my final comments. Cory, do you have any final comments before we finish up?
I don't know. I got pretty excited when you were talking about media analysis, because that's kind of my thing that I enjoy the most. So it seems like everybody can say, well, that's just propaganda. That's propaganda. That you hear it from the right all the time. And we have to be able to actually say, well, here's what's wrong with it. And I find that super important. But
yeah,
no, I really appreciate your time. I think I'm going to enjoy editing this so that I can listen to it over again and maybe even absorb some more of it. So,
right on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one book that we've done on this series of podcasts is Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality, which is his critique of the media. And so for those interested in sort of getting a deep dive and sort of a Marxist analysis of the media, I highly recommend people go back and check out that episode that we have. But yeah, again, I can't thank you enough. And so, where can people find your work, and how can they get involved in organizing?
One is, I think if you're thinking about any revolutionary or radical change, definitely go to pslweb.org. If you're thinking about being a part of that radical change, you can go to pslweb.org/join. I organize with the PSL in Boston, so you can go to I think it's Boss PSL on Instagram. We just opened up a Liberation Center. If you go on the Boston Liberation Center on Instagram and Facebook, I think it's just that. Also, I organize with the Jericho movement to free political prisoners, which is founded by political prisoners. Sometimes work with some anarchists and anarchist Black Cross, and shout out to them doing a lot of prison solidarity work. If you go to the Jericho movement, you can find out more about the fight to free people who are in prison for fighting racism and sexism, right? Yeah, that's where you can check out PSL and Jericho. And I think that's it. And thank y'all for having me on. First time I've done something like this with the book. So excited to see how it all works out. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm involved with the Indianapolis branch of the PSL. If you're interested and you're sort of in my area, ours is indialiberationcenter.org. To kind of keep up with our updates as well. And then, I'll go ahead and do my thing. So, cause I know Cory always asks me to, so you can find my stuff. You can find my stuff at justinclark.org. I'm currently working on an article about a radical, anarchist, leader named Voltairine de Cleyre. And I'm going to be writing an article about her, and her thoughts on the American revolutionary Thomas Paine for the newest issue of the Truth Seeker, which should be coming out later on in the summer. So I'm really excited about that coming out. And yeah, so that's that. And then Nino, I know you wanted to talk about your personal Instagram. Go ahead and you could share that too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the best at just adding a bunch of people, because now you get these Bitcoin folks trying to sell you whatever. But
I get Forex traders every day. It's so annoying.
But Instagram is a new African with a K _ Nino _ PSL. You can follow me on Instagram there. Also on Twitter, the same thing, New African Nino. And yeah, that's it.
Right
Awesome.
on. And I guess the only thing left is, what are we covering next time?
So next time, Cory, next time we're going to be doing 2 books in sort of celebration of the 1-year anniversary of doing this podcast with you. The first episode we did was on Kim Stanley Robinson's excellent book, The Ministry for the Future, which is all about climate change. So next time is going to be all about climate change. We're going to be covering 2 books. The first one we're going to be covering is a book called The Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal.
Okay.
It's by Kate Aronoff and a bunch of other folks. And the other book we're going to be covering is called On Fire, The Burning Case for the Green New Deal by Naomi Klein.
I actually have
So those
that
are going
one.
to be the 2. So those are the 2 that we're going to be covering. So next time is in celebration of the 1-year anniversary sort of Red Reviews. We're going to be doing it all about climate change.
Cool.
And then we've got a whole bunch of other stuff coming up. So we're going to be doing... we're going to get into anarchist theory. So we're going to read a couple books by Kropotkin. We're going to do Mutual Aid, and we're going to do The Conquest of Bread.
Cool.
And then we're also going to do this beast later on sometime in May.
Yes.
David Graeber and David Renbrough's book, The Dawn of Everything. So we'll be doing that as well. So yeah, there's going to be all kinds of really great stuff coming out this year. But yeah, next time we're going to be all about climate change.
We had a comment on the episode I just uploaded today asking about, when is the Trotsky book coming?
So the Trotsky book will probably come later this year. What we will be doing Trotskyist theory. Yeah, the book we're going to do is called The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects. So we're going to kind of get into his major theoretical contribution to Marxism, which is the idea of the permanent revolution. So that's the book we're going to do.
Cool.
For the trots out there, I'm excited to do that for y'all. Despite my disagreements, but I'm happy to do that. But yeah, so that's going to be coming for sure. Because I think the Red Reviews, despite my own particular perspective as a Marxist-Leninist, I like to try to cover a lot of different perspectives to give folks kind of an idea of what's out there.
For sure. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Nino. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your night to do this with us.
Thank you. Peace. Take care.
That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser or ratemypodcast.com would be great. If you want to find more from me, make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and a project I'm involved in with my friend Damien Marie at Hope that's called Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which is also found in my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's try to make sure we're applying critical thinking and reasoned skepticism when we're attacking the system. If we get caught up in bad thinking, we can derail ourselves.